Young and the Restless spoilers. The moment the plan shifted from strategy to violence, something cold and irreversible settled over the Newman men. Nick, Victor, and Adam had spent far too long letting Matt Clark under the name Mitch Becamo through their lives like a virus, poisoning everything he touched, turning Noah's future into a bargaining chip and Sienna's fate into a weapon. When the confrontation finally came, it was not clean, calculated, or noble. It was raw, primitive, and messy, the kind of moment that peeled back all the layers of power, wealth, and family legacy until only instinct was left. Adam's fists connected first, a brutal arc driven by months of suppressed fury, and when Matt went down, Nick followed, finally letting his anger flood out of the prison he had forced it into. Victor was there too, not throwing punches, but standing over the chaos with a grim, controlled rage that spoke louder than any physical blow. Annie, the corrupt cop who had aligned herself with Matt, tried to intervene, but the line had already been crossed. Adam disarmed her with ruthless efficiency, and within moments, both Matt and Annie were restrained, their hands tied, their advantages stripped away. Matt sat curses, laughing in that ugly, grating way that suggested he believed he still held power, even from the ground. He hurled obscenities at the family, questioning their strength, their intelligence, their ability to protect the people they loved. But this time, no one rose to the bait. The insults bounced off a wall made of fear and determination. They had something far more important to focus on than the venom of a cornered predator. For Nick, that focus was Sienna. Every second that passed without knowing where she was felt like a physical blow. His thoughts kept circling back to the same point. Matt was the key, the last living connection to her location, to whether she was alive, terrified, hurt, or worse. That knowledge burned in his chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe slowly or think calmly. The adrenaline that had fueled his punches did not fade when Matt was on the ground. It twisted into something sharper and more volatile. A determination to control the situation so completely that nothing, not fate, not fear, not Matt Clark, could rip someone else he loved away from him. Maybe that was why he insisted on being the one to drive Matt to where he needed to be moved away from the scene into custody or interrogation, depending on how things unfolded. Victor hesitated, his instincts warning him against allowing one son to escort a man like Matt alone, but the look in Nick's eyes was unyielding. It was the look of a man who needed to do this himself, who needed to be the one sitting behind the wheel, with Matt restrained in the back seat, not just as a tactical choice, but as a way of reclaiming some sliver of control in a situation that had stripped him of so much. Adam watched, conflicted, torn between his distrust of Matt and his understanding of Nick's emotional state. He knew better than anyone how dangerous it was to underestimate a man like Matt even when he seemed defeated. But he also knew what it felt like to have your life and your loved ones dangled over the edge of a cliff by someone else's cruelty. Victor gave a terse nod, the silent kind of consent that carried with it the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. They would follow behind. They would not let Nick out of their sight. It would be enough, Victor told himself. It had to be. The air felt strangely thin as Nick shoved Matt into the vehicle, the sound of the door slamming shut ringing louder than it should have. Annie was restrained elsewhere, handled by those who could ensure she would no longer be a threat. But Matt was the heart of the nightmare. As Nick pulled away, with Victor and Adam following in another car, an uneasy tension settled over the road. The kind that made the night feel darker and the distance between them stretch longer than it actually was. At first, everything seemed under control. Matt was tied, his hands bound, his body constrained. Nick told himself there was nothing the man could do from that position, nothing he could exploit. He kept his focus on the road, on the turns ahead, on the path that would lead to some kind of resolution. But the human brain has limitations, especially when it has been pummeled by fear, rage, and exhaustion. Nick's attention flickered, even if only for a heartbeat perhaps, at the thought of Sienna alone in some unknown place. Perhaps at the imagined image of Noah shattered by the news of what Matt had done. Perhaps at the weight of Victor and Adam's expectations trailing behind him. It was in that tiny slip in focus that Matt made his move. He had not been as unconscious as he seemed, nor as helpless. The pain from the beating only fueled his hatred. His mind, twisted and sharp in its cruelty, had been waiting for that exact moment. Nick did not realize what was happening until he felt the sudden shift of weight behind him, the rope scraping, the unnatural angle of movement that should not have been possible. Then there was an arm around his neck, thick and unyielding, squeezing the air from his lungs in a vicious chokehold. The shock of it sent a bolt of panic through him. His hands jerked on the wheel, the car swerving as his body reacted in instinctive terror. Pain radiated up into his skull as Matt tightened his grip, using the leverage of his position to pull backward, trying to wrench Nick away from control of the vehicle altogether. The world narrowed into a tunnel, the sound of tires screeching, the blurring of headlights, the desperate, instinctive struggle to keep both himself and the car from spiraling into disaster. He tried to fight back, to elbow, to slam his weight sideways, to break the hold, but each second that passed stole more oxygen, dimming the edges of his vision. Behind them, Victor and Adam saw the car ahead begin to swerve. At first it was subtle, just a barely perceptible drift between lanes, something that could be attributed to an uneven road or an overcorrection. But then the movement grew more erratic, sharp and jagged, like a wounded animal staggering toward an unseen edge. The dread that had been coiled in Victor's got leapt into full, visceral terror. Adam leaned forward, eyes narrowing, his body tensing as he watched the taillights in front of them veer dangerously close to the shoulder. They both knew something was wrong, horribly wrong, but there was no easy way to reach them in time, no words that could be spoken into the chaos to reset the trajectory. All they could do was watch his inevitability rush toward them. Inside the car, Nick fought with everything he had left. He could feel his consciousness stuttering, his hands barely obeying his desperate commands. The road blurred, the cliffs at the edge of his vision looming like dark jaws waiting to close. Matt snarled something in his ear, but the words no longer mattered. All that mattered was the wheel beneath his fingers and the knowledge that if he lost this battle, he might never see his family again. The vehicle lurched. One tire caught on loose gravel near the edge, and in that instant, gravity and momentum conspired against him. The car jerked violently, the front end tipping toward the side of the road where the land dropped away in a steep, unforgiving cliff. There was a moment of weightlessness, an almost surreal pause where the world seemed to hang on a breath, and then everything shattered into motion. The car slammed against the rock face, metal shrieking as it crumpled and twisted. The impact snapped through Nick's body, jarring his bones, slamming his skull forward. The force ripped Matt's grip from his throat, but it was too late. The vehicle ricocheted, skidding, tumbling, dragged by its own velocity toward the edge. Victor and Adam could only watch in horror as the car ahead of them tipped, pivoted, and then disappeared over the cliff. The sound of metal grinding against rock echoed through the air, followed by a sickening silence that lasted just long enough to make hope feel like an insult. And then came the explosion. Flames erupted from below, lighting up the night with a violent, orange glow. The shockwave hit their car, rocking it as if the earth itself had shuddered in revulsion at what had just happened. Victor's heart seemed to stop. For a man who had faced down enemies, betrayals, and lost more times than anyone should, this moment carried a terror unlike anything he had previously known. One son was behind the wheel of that car. Another had been just as determined to end this nightmare. And now, in the span of seconds, both might have been consumed by the inferno below. Adam's reaction was immediate and instinctive. He threw the car into park, flung the door open, and bolted toward the edge of the cliff. Every rational thought drowned by the singular urge to get to his brother. Victor followed, his steps fast but weighed down by a lifetime of fears he had never fully voiced. When they reached the edge and looked down, the scene that greeted them seared itself into their minds. The car was crumpled, engulfed in flames, black smoke curling upward like a dark hand reaching for the sky. The heat was intense, pushing them back even as they tried to lean closer. Sparks crackled in the air, and bits of debris popped and fell away, disappearing into the darkness below. There was no sign of movement, no silhouette dragging itself free of the wreckage, no sound but the roaring fire and the distant, echoing crash of settling metal. For a moment, time fractured. The present dissolved, and Victor saw flashes of every moment he had pushed his sons too hard, every time his pride had come before their safety, every time he had placed the Newman name above their peace. For Adam, the flames below were a mirror held up to every worst decision he had ever made, every time he had pushed Nick away, every resentment he had clung to when he should have chosen forgiveness. They shouted for them anyway, their voices swallowed by the inferno. They scanned the edges of the slope, searching for any sign that someone had been thrown free, that by some miracle, Nick or even Matt had escaped the metal coffin now burning in the ravine. The only response was the crackle of fire and the oppressive, suffocating sense that they had been too late. The horror of it settled over them like a shroud. Nick, who had once stood between his family and every threat that loomed, might now be lost because he had done the very same thing again. And as much as they despised Matt Clark, the twisted reality was that if Matt died in that wreck, so too might their last chance at finding Sienna quickly, before whatever he had set in motion reached its final, brutal conclusion. The question clawed at Victor's mind as he stood on the edge of the cliff, the fire reflecting in his eyes. Had his determination to end this threat driven them straight into tragedy? Beside him, Adam clenched his fists until his nails bit into his palms, forced to grapple with the possibility that, in trying to protect their family, they had just watched one of its most vital members disappear in a cloud of flame and twisted steel. The road behind them was eerily empty, the night unnaturally still except for the roar below. Somewhere out there, Sienna was still missing. Noah was still in danger of having his world obliterated. Sharon and the rest of the family were waiting for news that would either save them or break them. And here, at the edge of an exploding nightmare, Victor and Adam were left with a single, tormenting question echoing inside their chests. Had they just lost Nick in the process of trying to save everyone else? Down below, the fire raged on, devouring metal, rubber, and whatever secrets still clung to the wreckage. Whether it was the end of Matt Clark, the end of Nick Newman, or the beginning of an even darker chapter for the Newman family remained shrouded in smoke and uncertainty. In Genoa City, nothing was ever truly finished until the ashes cooled, and even then, the past had a way of clawing its way back to the surface. Victor Newman had seen men like Matt Clark his entire life, con men and predators who fed off fear and chaos, but there was something particularly vile about the way this one smiled. Even now, with his wrists already scraped from rough handling, with his plans exposed and his leverage slipping away, Matt still managed to look as if he were in control. It was that expression, that smug, mocking glint in his eyes, that finally stripped away the last of Victor's restraint. He stepped forward not as a polished titan of industry, not as the cold strategist who moved people across the board like chess pieces, but as a father and a grandfather whose family had been targeted one time too many. He demanded to know whether Matt had honestly believed he could come after the Newmans and walk away unscathed, whether he had intended to launch a physical attack as well as an emotional one, whether this entire ordeal had been built on the fantasy of watching Victor and his children crumble at his feet. And when Matt's expression shifted just enough to confirm the answer without words, Victor's response was brutally simple. His fist drove into Matt's midsection with a depth of force that came from years of clenched fury, the kind that hadn't always had a target but now found one with perfect clarity. The blow knocked the air from Matt's lungs and bent him forward, his body folding over the edge of the heavy table behind him. Before he could recover, Victor's hands were on him, gripping his shoulders, slamming him flat against the surface and pinning him there with a strength that belied his age. For a brief moment, the predator looked like prey, splayed out and gasping, no longer the puppeteer, but the puppet tangled in his own strings. Nick watched the scene unfold with a storm roiling inside him. Every instinct screamed at him to do more, to inflict more, to make Matt feel even a fraction of the terror he had inflicted on Noah, on Sienna, on Sharon, and everyone else caught in his orbit. But beneath the rage, there was also a razor-sharp purpose. Violence might feel cathartic in the moment, but what Nick wanted more than anything was finality. He wanted to ensure that Matt would never again have the power to pick up a phone, send a message, whisper a threat, or manipulate someone he loved into another nightmare. Standing beside Victor, he told Matt coldly, clearly, without a shred of ambiguity, that his reign of destruction over this family ended here. No more threats. No more games. No more using their guilt and their love against them. Whatever happened next, Matt would not be given another chance to shatter someone else's life. With that, Nick reached for the zip ties waiting nearby. The plastic strips, simple but effective, the kind law enforcement used when handcuffs were too cumbersome and time was of the essence. He pulled Matt's arms behind his back, the resistance immediate but pointless. Each time Matt twisted, the plastic dug deeper into his skin, tightening with the cruel efficiency of something designed for control, not comfort. Nick made sure the ties were secure, pulling until he heard the last sharp click, until he could feel the tension humming between the bindings and Matt's bones. There was no satisfaction in the work, just grim necessity. Once it was done, he straightened and stepped back, chest heaving, muscles taut, his mind already moving ahead to the next step, getting Matt out of there, away from their other vulnerabilities, and into a space where the threat he posed could finally be reduced to something manageable. The decision to take Matt himself, to physically escort him, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. Nick needed to see this through, needed to be the one holding the line between what Matt had done and what he might have done if left unchecked. Victor and Adam could oversee the perimeter, call ahead, coordinate with whomever they could still trust. But Nick wanted Matt where he could see him, close enough that if the man tried anything, he could shut it down immediately. On the way out, Matt stumbled, and Nick might have found the image satisfying under different circumstances. Now it barely registered. He shoved Matt toward the car with a controlled force, opened the back door and guided him in, making sure his restrained hand stayed behind him. The door slammed with a heavy finality, echoing like a punctuation mark at the end of a long, brutal sentence. From the outside, the situation looked under control. Victor's expression had hardened into stone, but there was the faintest nod that said he understood why Nick needed to be the one behind the wheel. Adam, standing slightly back, watched with narrowed eyes, his own mistrust of Matt warring with the knowledge that there were some battles a man had to fight himself. They would follow close, keep him in sight, close the gap if anything went wrong. It was a system of checks and balances built on blood, experience, and the knowledge that when one human drove toward danger, the others would always be a few car lengths behind. Once the engine hummed to life and the car rolled forward, Nick allowed himself a small breath, the kind that barely loosened the knot in his chest. He told himself he was safe. Nat's wrists were bound. The doors were locked. Victor and Adam were behind him. The worst, he tried to believe, was over. Somewhere in the fog of his conscience, though he could still hear Sienna's name, still see Noah's face, pale and lined with fear, still feel the weight of Sharon's grief pressing into the spaces between his ribs. Rage and responsibility tangled inside him until every heartbeat felt like a punch against his own sternum. In the back seat, Matt shifted, the plastic biting deeper into his wrists. At first, his movements were small, experimental, the calculated fidgeting of a man who understood physics almost as well as he understood human weakness. He pressed his hands against the upholstery, testing how much room he had to work with, how much give there was in the plastic, how far he could twist before pain became disabling. And as he moved, he started to talk. He did not raise his voice or shout. Instead, he let the words drip into the air like venom. He spoke about Sharon, about her history, about all the times life had already taken so much from her. He framed it like an observation, but every syllable was a weapon. He suggested that Nick must be exhausted by now, always fighting to save her, always running into the burning building of her life only to come out singed and bleeding. He implied that maybe, just maybe, all this chaos had started because Sharon mattered so much to him, because anyone watching could see how she anchored him. Matt knew where to cut, and he cut deep, poking at Nick's old wounds as if he had all the time in the world. He mocked the idea that Nick could ever truly protect everyone he loved, hinting that sooner or later, someone was going to slip through his fingers no matter how hard he clenched them. Nick's grip on the steering wheel tightened as the words slithered into his mind. He told himself not to react, not to give Matt the satisfaction of knowing he had hit a nerve. He focused on the yellow lines in the center of the road, on the curve of the asphalt as it traced along the side of the cliffs, on the faint glow of Victor and Adam's headlights in his rearview mirror. But it was impossible to completely shut the man out. Every remark Matt made about Sharon rippled backward through years of pain and struggle. It was not just what he said, it was how he said it, as if he had seen something in Nick's life and filed it away for future use, knowing this moment would come. Then Matt shifted his target. He turned the conversation toward the present, toward the car, toward the grim reality of what was happening. He remarked on how bold it was for Nick to take this into his own hands, to personally escort the man who had threatened his family, as if Nick were some kind of executioner driving a condemned man to his end. He wondered aloud if that was the plan all along, if Nick had fantasized about the idea of burying him somewhere far away from the city, making him dig his own grave, standing over him while the earth swallowed the last piece of evidence connecting him to the damage he had caused. He questioned whether Nick actually had the capacity to kill, not just in a moment of rage, but with deliberate intent. It was a taunt and a test, a way of probing the line between who Nick believed he was and who he might become under enough pressure. He followed it with a cruel warning, saying that nothing would go the way Nick expected. It never did, especially for men like him who thought control was a matter of sheer will. People like Nick believed they could bend outcomes to their favor by clenching their jaw and tightening their hands. But life and men like Matt had a way of slipping through those fingers at the worst possible time. It was a promise, in Matt's mind, that the story unfolding in that car would not end the way Nick wanted. And as he talked, he kept working at the ties. The plastic was unyielding, but desperation lent him a kind of vicious creativity. He twisted his wrists, ignoring the sting and the wet warmth of blood beginning to smear along the edges of the binding. He braced his hands against the base of the seat and pushed, arching his shoulders in a way that forced the zip ties to drag upward, millimeter by millimeter. It was agony, each small movement feeling like a razor blade dragging across raw skin. But he welcomed the pain. Pain meant progress. Pain meant the plastic was cutting deeper, maybe weakening, maybe stretching just enough. Nick was too focused on what lay ahead. Literal road, metaphorical futurato track every subtle movement behind him. He heard the rustle, felt the shift in the air, but his brain still clung to the illusion of safety. He had done this right. Matt was tied. The doors were locked. Victor and Adam were behind him. It would be all right, until it wasn't. In one abrupt, terrifying instant, Matt's hands snapped free from the tension of being held in place. The zip ties did not break, but his wrist slid far enough that he could wrench his arms outward. The sudden movement pulled a grunt from his chest and sent a fresh wave of blood to the surface of his skin, but he didn't care. He had what he needed. In the space between one breath and the next, he surged forward. Nick barely registered the sound of his body launching itself off the seat before he felt it, the crushing force of an arm looping around his neck from behind. The plastic still circled Matt's wrists. He used it like a rope, hooking it across Nick's throat and yanking backward with deadly intent. The pressure was immediate and brutal. Nick's breath cut off in a strangled gasp, his hands flying instinctively toward the constriction at his neck, fingers clawing at the restraint that wasn't there. His grip on the steering wheel faltered, the car jerking as his body spasmed in surprise and panic. The world outside the windshield lurched, the road veering sideways as the vehicle drifted dangerously close to the edge of the lane. He tried to correct, to steer back into position, but Matt's hold tightened, pulling him backward against the seat, wrenching his spine and driving the air from his lungs. Stars exploded at the edges of his vision. The roar of the engine blurred into a dull, distant sound drowned out by the pounding of his own pulse in his ears. His muscles strained, one hand fighting to keep control of the wheel while the other scrabbled uselessly at the plastic biting into his throat. The car swayed again, the tires slipping over loose gravel near the shoulder, sending a spray of dirt and stone into the night. Behind them, Victor and Adam watched in horror as the vehicle ahead of them began to drift in a way that no skilled driver ever would. It swerved too sharply, corrected too slowly. The shifting of its weight spoke of chaos inside more than any mechanical failure. Victor's stomach turned to ice. Adam's heart jumped into his throat. They accelerated, trying to close the distance, but the road curved sharply, the cliffs dropping away into darkness just beyond the guardrail. They were close, but not close enough. Inside the car, Nick's lungs screamed. Every attempt to pull air in was met with the unyielding clamp of Matt's improvised garrote. His eyes burned, his hands shook, and the wheel jerked beneath his weakening grip. The headlights carved an erratic path through the darkness, illuminating jagged rock and open air where there should have been nothing but safe pavement. He could feel the car fighting him, feel the center of gravity shifting in a way that signaled impending disaster. He knew that if he blacked out now, there would be no recovery, no second chance, no controlled skid back onto the road. The edge loomed closer, unseen but felt. Gravel crackled beneath the tires. The car tilted slightly, the weight of it rolling toward the outside. Nick made one last, desperate attempt to wrench himself free, throwing his weight forward, yanking at the wheel, twisting in Matt's grip with everything his fading strength could muster. For a heartbeat, the tension shifted. The hold loosened by a fraction, enough for one ragged gasp of air to tear its way into his burning lungs. It might have been just enough to save him or just enough to let him fully register the horror of what was about to happen.